Mercedes may have just triggered the first major controversy of the 2026 Formula One season. Because after the Australian Grand Prix, two teams inside the Mercedes engine family are asking a very uncomfortable question. How can the same engine produce such a different result? McLaren has the Mercedes power unit. Williams has the Mercedes power unit. And yet, in Melbourne, the factory Mercedes team suddenly looked half a second faster when the electrical power was fully deployed. 3/10 of that difference, according to early estimates inside the paddock, may come purely from how Mercedes extracts energy from the hybrid system. Not a different engine. The same engine. Used in a way nobody else seems to understand yet. Now the tension inside the paddock is rising. Team principals are talking. Engine data is being compared. And the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile is already reviewing the technical details behind a possible loophole in the new 2026 engine regulations. If that loophole exists, it could define the entire era. If it does not, it means Mercedes has discovered something even more dangerous. A level of engine integration the rest of the grid cannot replicate. And what happened in Australia might only be the beginning. Because the deeper engineers look into the data from Melbourne, the more one detail keeps appearing. A sudden, extremely aggressive spike in electrical deployment. Exactly the kind of detail that can win races. Or trigger an investigation. So the real question is no longer whether Mercedes is fast. The real question is whether they found something hidden inside the rules. And if they did, the entire championship could be decided by it. If you enjoy deep Formula One investigations like this, subscribe to the channel, because what we are about to uncover from the Australian Grand Prix changes the entire picture of the 2026 season. Something strange was already happening before the race even started in Melbourne. Because during testing, a few engineers had quietly noticed a pattern in the Mercedes data. Not a massive difference. Not something obvious on the timing screens. But a very specific behavior when the car accelerated out of slow corners. At first, most teams ignored it. Pre-season testing is chaotic. Fuel loads change. Engine modes are hidden. Teams bluff. But Australia was different. Australia was the first moment everyone had to show their real performance. And the moment qualifying began, that small pattern suddenly became impossible to ignore. Every time the Mercedes exited a corner, the acceleration curve looked sharper, more immediate. Almost like the electrical power arrived in a single, perfectly timed burst. Now here is why that matters. Under the new 2026 regulations, the hybrid system plays a much bigger role than before. The electrical deployment can reach levels close to 100 kilowatts in key moments. Which means the way a team manages that energy can completely transform how the car behaves on exit. And this is exactly where engineers from other teams began asking questions. Because when they compared their own data with the Mercedes traces, something did not line up. The hardware looked identical. But the behavior did not. And this is where McLaren started to realize they might be missing something important. Andrea Stella later described the situation in a way that surprised many people inside the paddock. He said the team felt like they were discovering the engine step by step, almost blind, reacting to what the car was doing instead of predicting it. That is not how Formula One teams normally operate. Usually, engineers arrive at a race weekend with detailed simulation models. They know exactly how the engine will deploy energy. They know how the battery will behave. They know which engine maps will be used at every phase of the race. But in Australia, McLaren did not have that level of certainty. Instead, they were still learning. Still experimenting. Still trying to understand how far the system could go. And while they were learning, Mercedes already looked completely comfortable, completely prepared. And that difference in understanding started to show very clearly in qualifying. Because when Mercedes switched the power unit into its most aggressive deployment mode, the lap time improvement was immediate, sudden, almost shocking. That was the moment James Vowles, the Williams team principal and former Mercedes strategist, admitted something that made the situation even more intriguing. He said the team only truly realized the scale of the performance difference when Mercedes unlocked the full potential of the engine. And the estimated gap, purely from how the engine was being used, was close to 3/10 of a second. 3/10. From the same engine supplier. In Formula One terms, that is enormous. But here is the detail that really changed the conversation inside the paddock. Because when analysts began comparing all four cars using Mercedes engines, they noticed something important. Only one team was extracting that level of performance consistently. The factory team. Which means the advantage might not come from the engine itself. It might come from how the engine interacts with everything else. The battery. The cooling system. The chassis integration. And most importantly, the control software that manages energy deployment. And if that is true, then Mercedes may have done something extremely clever. Something perfectly legal, but incredibly difficult for their customer teams to replicate quickly. Which raises a much bigger question. Because if Mercedes truly understands this engine better than anyone else on the grid, then what we saw in Australia might not be their peak performance. It might only be the beginning. But the real tension inside the paddock did not start during the race. It started when the engineers began analyzing the telemetry after the Australian Grand Prix. Because once the weekend ended, teams finally had access to much more detailed data. GPS traces, acceleration curves, energy deployment windows. And when analysts from rival teams began overlaying the Mercedes data with their own simulations, one particular pattern appeared again and again. The Mercedes power unit was not simply delivering more power. It was delivering that power at very precise moments. Moments that perfectly matched the traction phase of the car. That sounds like a small detail. But in Formula One, timing is everything. If electrical energy is deployed too early, the tires spin. If it arrives too late, the car loses acceleration. But if it arrives at the exact moment the rear tires reach peak grip, the effect is dramatic. The car launches forward. And that is exactly what the Mercedes seemed to be doing in Australia. Over, and over, and over again. Now here is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because several engineers began asking whether this advantage was purely mechanical, or something much more sophisticated. Something inside the control systems. The hybrid era of Formula One relies heavily on extremely advanced energy management algorithms. These systems constantly monitor battery charge, throttle input, braking phases, temperature levels, and track position. Thousands of calculations every second. All designed to decide exactly when electrical power should be deployed. And if Mercedes has developed a more advanced model for predicting those moments, the advantage could be enormous. Not because the engine is stronger, but because the energy arrives at the perfect time. And according to several analysts studying the Melbourne data, that is exactly what appears to be happening. But here is the problem. Customer teams do not necessarily have access to the same internal simulation models used by the factory team. They receive the engine. They receive operational guidelines. But the deeper predictive tools used by the manufacturer often remain internal. That is where the frustration inside McLaren and Williams begins to grow. Because they know the potential exists. They can see it in the Mercedes car. They can measure it on the straights. They can detect it in the acceleration traces. But they cannot yet reproduce it. Which means they are racing with the same engine, without fully unlocking its performance. And in a championship where qualifying positions can be decided by hundredths of a second, that difference becomes enormous. But the situation becomes even more complicated when politics enter the equation. Because the moment one team appears to gain a technical advantage under a brand new regulation set, rival manufacturers immediately begin asking the governing body to review the rules. That is standard behavior in Formula One. And it is already happening. Behind closed doors, several technical discussions have taken place about the interpretation of compression limits and hybrid deployment strategies under the new engine regulations. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile has not announced any rule violation. Not even an official investigation. But the fact that these conversations are already happening after just one race tells you something important. The paddock is paying very close attention. Because if Mercedes has truly found a clever interpretation inside the rules, something that unlocks extra performance without breaking any regulations, then the entire grid will be forced to react. Some teams will try to replicate it. Others will push for technical clarifications. And a few will demand rule adjustments before the advantage becomes impossible to close. Which brings us to the most important question after Australia. Did Mercedes simply arrive better prepared than everyone else? Or did they discover something hidden deep inside the 2026 regulations? Something the rest of the grid is only beginning to understand. Because if that second possibility is true, then what we witnessed in Melbourne was not just the first race of the season. It was the first warning. But while the debate about software and energy deployment was growing inside the paddock, another theory started circulating quietly among engineers. A theory connected to something much more fundamental. The combustion process inside the engine itself. Because before the season even started, several engine manufacturers had already raised questions about how the new compression limits in the 2026 regulations should be interpreted. At first, it looked like a purely technical discussion. A normal clarification. But after the Australian Grand Prix, that conversation suddenly became much more serious. Why? Because if Mercedes discovered a clever interpretation of the compression ratio rules, the benefits could be enormous. Higher efficiency. More energy recovered. better interaction between the combustion engine and the hybrid system. And that combination could explain something that analysts noticed in Melbourne. The Mercedes was not just quick on one lap. It was efficient over an entire stint, which is far more difficult to achieve. Normally, when teams push aggressive energy deployment, the battery begins to struggle later in the lap. The system needs to recover energy under braking. The balance becomes fragile. But the Mercedes looked unusually stable. The electrical boost appeared exactly when it was needed. And yet the system never seemed to run out of energy. That is extremely difficult to achieve under the new regulations. Which means either Mercedes has developed a very advanced hybrid management system, or the combustion engine itself is operating with remarkable efficiency. Possibly both. And that possibility is exactly why the technical discussions inside Formula One are becoming more intense. Because if the advantage comes from the combustion efficiency itself, then the situation becomes far more sensitive. Changing software strategies is one thing. Changing the interpretation of engine regulations is something very different. It can trigger technical directives. It can trigger rule clarifications. And sometimes it can even reshape the competitive balance of an entire season. But here is the detail many fans may not realize. The Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile was already looking into this topic before the Australian Grand Prix even happened. Technical meetings with engine manufacturers had taken place earlier in the year. Experts from different suppliers discussed how the compression rules should be applied. And according to several sources inside the paddock, Mercedes was actively involved in those conversations. That does not mean they did anything illegal. In fact, quite the opposite. Teams often present their design interpretations to the governing body before the season begins. They want confirmation that their approach respects the regulations. And if the federation gives its approval, the design becomes legal. At least for the moment. But here is where Formula One politics becomes complicated. Even if a design is technically legal, rival teams may still pressure the governing body to review the interpretation again. Especially if the performance advantage becomes too large. And after the first race in Melbourne, that pressure is already starting to build. Because the performance difference between Mercedes and their own customer teams raises a very uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the advantage is not just the engine. Maybe it is the way Mercedes integrates everything. Engine, hybrid system, battery cooling, software control, chassis interaction. All designed as one single package. That level of integration takes years to perfect. Years of simulation. Years of development. Years of internal testing. And if Mercedes truly arrived in the new era with that level of preparation, then the rest of the grid might be facing a very familiar situation. A team that understands the rules better than everyone else. A team that finds performance where others see limitations.